Happy Thursday, everyone. I just have a few announcements before we get started. Today's presentation is hosted by HR Simple in partnership with BSK. If you have any questions, please enter them in the question box and we will get to them during the webinar. If you need to view a video of this recording, you can go to hrsimple.com/events. HR Simple provides federal and state-specific manuals. All of our manuals have been updated with new COVID-19 chapters. New chapters include the new Families First Coronavirus Response Act poster, telecommuting policies and agreements, and how to handle pandemics in the workplace. Today you can use code COVIDWebinar40 at hrsimple.com off any of our products for attending today's webinar. All of our manuals are written by top labor attorneys such as Lou, one of our presenters today. Lou represents employers and management in all aspects of labor and employment law. His areas of experience include collective bargaining, workplace investigations, labor audits, supervisory training, wage and hour issues, jury trials in both state and federal courts, wage incentive plans, and OFCCP audits and proceedings. Lou also serves several insurance companies as panel counsel with respect to employment litigation matters. Adam has an intimate knowledge of all aspects of federal and state court litigation and has guided clients through every stage of the litigation process. Adam also has significant trial experience and has obtained favorable jury verdicts for his clients in both federal and state courts. In 2018, Adam obtained an $825,000 jury verdict for his client. He currently focuses his practice on representing employers in litigation matters involving discrimination, harassment, and retaliation under the FMLA, the New York Human Rights Law, and the ADEA. Mallory represents employers in complex labor and employment litigation matters, including wage and hour class actions and employment discrimination and retaliation cases. She represents employers in federal and state courts, as well as before administrative agencies such as the New York State Department of Labor and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. She also serves as a counselor to employers, advising them on matters ranging from wage and hour best practices to navigating hiring and termination decisions, personnel policy structuring, family and medical leave issues, and disability accommodations. So now that we've learned a little bit about our speakers, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Adam so we can go ahead and get started.
Anna, thanks so much. And thank you to everyone for being on the webinar today. We are going to cover a topic that I know is very important to all of you on the webinar today and every business in the country right now. We're going to talk about reopening and considerations for employers as they reopen. So today you heard from Anna that Lou DiLorenzo, myself, and Mallory Campbell are all going to be presenting. And here's what we're going to go over in general broad strokes. First, we're going to cover governmental reopening requirements generally. We're then going to walk through the different elements of reopening, including a workplace risk analysis, workplace safety plan, how you can anticipate issues associated with reopening, and how you can communicate what your plans are to the public and to your employees as everyone starts to get back to the new normal. So first, we're going to talk about governmental reopening requirements. I have on the slide reopening in New York, but I first want to talk generally about other states as well. So every state is going to have its own reopening requirements, and in many cases, localities will have their own specific reopening requirements. You may see a county or an area that has a different reopening requirement than a neighboring county or a neighboring geographic area. So that's something that you're really going to have to focus on with your counsel as you prepare to reopen. Reopening requirements from the government perspective are generally tied to a couple of different things. First, most governments are looking for public health benchmarks. So certain reduction in cases, reduction in hospitalizations, deaths, contact tracing capabilities, things like that. Or some combination of those requirements. Most governments also have a phased reopening in place. Every state calls it something different. In New York, we call it phase 1, phase 2, et cetera. In Pennsylvania, for example, they have red, yellow, and green. In Maryland, they use stages, stage 1, 2, and 3, but it's essentially the same process. Some businesses will be allowed to open in phase 1, some more in phase 2, et cetera, as you go along. Most states have also been operating where certain businesses that are either deemed quote unquote essential or critical have been allowed to continue operating all along. So for example, grocery stores are one example of a business that's been deemed as essential. So you have these phased reopenings, plus you have essential businesses that have been operating all along in every state. Now, in New York, I'm going to use New York as an example because that is where we practice. New York is using the phased approach that I mentioned before. So early on, when the governor issued some of his earliest executive orders, he closed all non-essential businesses. And for months, only businesses that were deemed to be essential could be operating in person. The state put out a list of what constitutes an essential business, and it has different categories of businesses that are included within it. If a business didn't fit within one of those essential categories but felt that it should be considered essential, the state allowed those businesses to apply to the Empire State Development Corporation for approval to operate as an essential business. So for several months in New York, you couldn't operate unless you were essential. The governor then announced this phased reopening plan. Each phase has different industries that are permitted to reopen. For example, phase 1, which actually went into effect on May 15th for certain areas, included construction, manufacturing, agricultural, retail, but pickup only, and wholesale trade. The governor's phased approach not only delineated businesses that could open by category, but also by region. So he broke the state into a number of regions. Where we are is Central New York, there's the capital region, there's Western New York. And so your ability to enter into phase 1 in New York was based on which region you were part of. And the governor of New York, like the governor of many other states, used public health benchmarks to determine whether or not phase 1 could start. So in New York, we've been in phase 1 for the last 2 weeks. We are supposed to be able to start phase 2 tomorrow, but I'll explain why that might not happen, or if it does happen, the phase 2 industries are going to need some information from the government to get going. All right, so when phase 1 started, what the governor did was it started on May 15th for a number of regions. On May 14th, the state put out guidance. So 24 hours before phase 1 was set to begin, the state put out guidance on what businesses needed to do to reopen. If they were part of a phase 1 industry, here's what you need to do. And the information the state provided were a summary guidance checklist. So there was a form that was a chart that said, here are the required elements for reopening for industries in phase 1. And it was broken out by each of the industries. For each of the phase 1 industries, the state also put out detailed guidance, which included an affirmation. And the reason this is important is because the affirmation says that you as a business understand all of the requirements for reopening, and you are affirming that you are going to follow them. So businesses had to look through that if they were in the phase 1 industries. The guidance from the state also included a template workplace safety plan. We're going to go into a lot of detail about this. It also included FAQs, which tried to anticipate questions that businesses would have. It didn't do a great job of anticipating all the questions, but it did anticipate some. The state guidance for phase one industries also provided information on how to make complaints. And this shows the government's commitment to making sure that only phase one industries were opening. It provided specific information for anyone who wanted to make a complaint about a business that was opening, that either shouldn't have been opening, or that wasn't following the state's requirements. So that's what information the state provided 24 hours before phase one opened. So what a lot of businesses were asking us, when can I open? I am a phase one industry. For example, I'm a construction company. How do I go about opening? And there are a number of things or boxes you have to check in order to open if you're a phase one industry. First, you have to qualify as a phase one industry. You have to fit into one of those categories. The state actually put out a tool that is a reopening lookup tool for businesses to use, where you can put in your NAICS code and you can see whether or not you've been permitted to open. So if you are in the Western New York region and you are a X business, you'd put in your code in this lookup tool that the state put out, and it would tell you whether or not you were permitted to reopen in phase one. So that's checkpoint number one. Are you a phase one industry? Checkpoint two is that you must be in a geographic area where reopening is permitted. So certain areas within New York, like Central New York, the Southern Tier, were the North Country, were allowed to reopen phase one right on May 15th. Other areas within the state couldn't open on May 15th because they didn't meet the public health benchmarks. New York City, the New York City area still cannot enter into phase one because they haven't met the public health benchmarks. As of right now, every other area in the state has been permitted to enter into phase one. So checkpoint number two about whether you can reopen is whether or not you are in a geographic area that's been permitted to reopen. Checkpoint number three is whether or not you have a workplace safety plan. So here's where a lot of businesses got confused. If you're in a phase one industry, I'll take the construction example. How do you know what needs to go into your workplace safety plan? The government provided you with 3 documents. It provided you with a summary chart, a detailed written out guidance document, and then a template plan. And sometimes the template plan would contradict with the detailed or summary guidance. So it raised a lot of issues, but at a minimum, you need to work through that template plan, put it together, have it on site, and implement it in your business in order to reopen. We're going to talk a lot more about what needs to go into those plans in a minute, but having a workplace safety plan in place is another checkpoint for reopening. The last checkpoint, and I briefly mentioned this, is that you have to complete a guidance affirmation. And what this is on the website, under the detailed guidance document, you as a construction company, you would read through the detailed guidance that's listed for construction companies. At the end of that guidance document, there's a link that you click on. It takes you to a new form, and the new form is an affirmation. You have to type in your business name, certain information about your business, what phase one category you fit into, and you have to affirm that you're going to follow all of the guidance requirements in order to reopen. So those were the four things that you had to check off in order to reopen if you were a phase one industry. Now, this unfortunately left some questions for essential businesses. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things the state put out with its guidance was an FAQ section. So this FAQ section was intended to address questions that would arise. One of the FAQs asks whether or not essential businesses have to comply with these new requirements. Do they have to sign an affirmation, and do they have to have a workplace safety plan in place? The FAQs say that essential businesses do need to follow that guidance. The problem with that recommendation or that statement is that not all essential businesses fit within one of the phase one categories. So this is what we're saying here on this slide. critical questions. If you are an essential business, here's your analysis, how you proceed through your analysis. Is your business in an industry that is allowed in phase one? So let's say you were a critical essential manufacturing business that was allowed to stay open the whole time. There is now phase one guidance for manufacturing businesses. What you have to do is relatively simple. You have to follow the manufacturing guidance, even though you've been operating all along. You sign the affirmation, you create a workplace safety plan that follows the manufacturing guidance. If you are, where the confusion comes in, like I said, is if you are a business that has been essential, but that has not been or is not contained within one of those phase one categories. So if we go to question number 2, what business operation is permitted? Again, like I said earlier, you have to check which region you're in and whether or not phase one was allowed to start in that region. Now, what new reopening requirements apply? If you fit within one of the phase one industries, like I said, those are the things you have to go through. The slide identifies some of the specific topics that have to be covered in your safety plan. We'll go through those in a minute. Timing, I did want to make a point about this. If you are an essential business, it doesn't say, the guidance doesn't tell you when you have to sign the affirmation and put your workplace safety plan into place. If you are a phase one business and you haven't been operating, you're not essential, the guidance says that you cannot open until you sign the affirmation and have your workplace safety plan in place. If you are an essential business though, you've been operating all along. There isn't any specific guidance as far as timing for those businesses. What we have been telling clients is that you should do it as soon as possible. The FAQs make it clear that you don't have to close until you get the affirmation signed and the workplace safety plan in place, but you should do this as soon as you possibly can. All right, now, here's where some confusion arises. Let's say you are a grocery store. You have been operating all along as an essential business, but you don't fit in one of the categories for phase one industries. So you think, what am I supposed to do? You've told me in the FAQs that I need to comply with this guidance, but I don't fit into the guidance that you provided because it only applies to phase one industries. So the advice we've been providing to clients is this. If you're an essential business and you don't fit into one of the phase one categories, first of all, you cannot fill out the affirmation. The first question on the affirmation asks, which of the phase one industries do you fit into? If you're an essential business that doesn't fit into one of those categories, then you cannot complete the affirmation. So if you're an essential business that's not in a phase one category, you can't do the affirmation. With respect to the workplace safety plans, the template that the state provided across industries, phase one industries, was exactly the same. So the template for manufacturing was the same as the template for wholesale trade, was the same as the template for construction. We also know that the state has released guidance with respect to reopening religious institutions and beaches, and the templates used for that guidance has been exactly the same as the templates used for the phase one industries. So we know, with pretty good certainty that the templates that are going to apply to your business, even if you're not in phase one, should be very similar to the templates that are currently available. So what we've been recommending is that all essential businesses that don't fit into one of the phase one categories start preparing your workplace safety plan based on the templates provided by the state already. If there are some things that you need to tweak based on specific requirements applicable to your industry, then you can do that when the state releases later guidance. But you need to get a plan in place as soon as possible. The same recommendation with respect to timing applies. You're an essential business, you can stay open. You should just try to do this as quickly as possible. All right, so that section was on what governmental requirements there are for you to reopen. now I want to switch gears a little bit and start talking about specific safety procedures and processes that you should put in place. And this is what's going to go into your workplace safety plan. So the first thing that you really need to do is conduct a workplace risk analysis. This is going to be extremely employer specific and extremely fact dependent. It's going to be specific even within the same industry. So you may be an office-based business, and you may have risks that are very different than another office-based business. So you're really going to have to sit down and think these issues through. So what you're looking for, what you're thinking about, is where in my business is there a risk of transmitting the virus? Are there particular areas where transmission is more likely? So for example, if you are in an office business, let's say you have cubicles, and the cubicles aren't separated by any partitions, and the cubicles are less than 6 feet apart from one another, you could think, and in your analysis, you'd say one of my risk areas is when people are sitting at their cubicles and they're less than 6 feet away from one another. You could also think, and look through this, when we have meetings in conference rooms, it's very difficult to maintain 6 feet of social distance. A conference room is what's referred to as a common area. Think through all the common areas. Where are the risk points for your specific business? The answer is going to be very different if you are a manufacturer. You're going to have different issues on the manufacturing floor, but it's a specific analysis that you have to undertake. So you're also going to look at, when you're conducting this analysis, if you have customers or visitors in your business or facility, where are the risk points for those individuals? How are you going to, or what are you going to look at as far as if you're a grocery store, what precautions can you possibly take? So you're going to look at where specifically the risk is. I think that a workplace risk analysis should also include a cost-benefit analysis. So going back to the office space, there may be some precautions that you feel are too great, or they come at too great of a cost to justify bringing people back to the office. You may be functioning just fine working remotely. So it might make more sense for you to just stay working remotely until there's additional guidance, or it would be easier or less costly for you to take the precautions that you would need to take to bring people back. All right, so after you conduct your workplace safety analysis, you're going to have to consider what has to be in your workplace safety plan. And these are the documents that at least New York State is requiring. And what I'm going to do is walk through the requirements for a New York workplace safety plan. But these topics and categories need to be covered in any workplace safety plan, no matter what state you're in. So it is generally applicable to everyone. So first of all, New York's going to require physical distancing. New York calls it physical distancing. Some other people call it social distancing. Your state might call it social distancing. Essentially, it is, what steps are you going to take to keep people away from one another, or to mitigate the risk when you know they're going to have to be close to one another? So for example, in New York, the state is requiring that masks are worn at all times when individuals, either employees or otherwise, cannot maintain 6 feet of distance. So this becomes an interesting example in the office setting. If you have offices in your office setting where you can maintain 6 feet of social distance, it's probably okay to let people not sit at their office, in their office, while they're wearing a mask. So you can say you can maintain your 6 feet of social distance, so you don't need to wear your mask. But then the issue arises, what if they need to get up to go to the bathroom? Are you going to require everybody to wear a mask when they leave their office, even though they might not at the time have less than 6 feet of space? So this is an interesting thing and something that your business should think about. Are you going to require masks at all times when someone's not at their office? The New York requirements also require occupancy limitations. Now, I should say that this is for phase 1 industries. We don't have guidance yet from the state regarding phase 2, phase 3, or phase 4. With respect to occupancy limitations, the guidelines generally say that you can't have more than 50% of maximum occupancy. It's important to note that this is not 50% of your workforce. It's 50% of your building's maximum occupancy. In New York, your physical distancing plan also has to include a plan to address situations where social distancing is not possible. Here is where you're going to plug in the information that you gathered when you conducted your workplace risk analysis. So here's where you're going to say, here are the specific areas where social distancing might not be possible, and here are the steps we're going to take. For example, in the halls, we're going to make, if it's an office space, we're going to make traffic only flow in one direction to prevent people from crossing paths as they're walking by one another. Or in your meeting rooms, if you're going to allow conference rooms to be operating, you're going to remove chairs from the conference room so that there isn't the temptation to have less than 6 feet of social distance. So these are some of the things that you would want to articulate in your plan, how you're going to address areas where you can't maintain 6 feet of social distance. Another thing that must be included in a New York workplace safety plan is a section on personal protective equipment. The New York requirement is very clear that all employers have to provide a face covering to their employees free of cost. It doesn't specify what face covering you have to provide. Employers can use cloth face coverings, disposable surgical masks, any face covering that they deem to be appropriate. The policy also has to specifically state how you're going to get your masks and how many you're going to have on hand just in case there's a shortage and you need more for your employees. The policy also has to address how these masks will either be disposed of or cleaned. In New York, if you ask your employees to launder a cloth mask on a nightly basis, there may be some compensable time in there, depending on a variety of factors, so that's something you should consider. The plans also have to include specific information about hygiene and cleaning. We know at a very minimum that the plans are going to have to follow state and federal guidelines. The CDC has released very specific guidelines about what cleaning and disinfection is appropriate as businesses return to work. So your policy is going to have to state at the minimum that they're going to follow those. Here's an issue that has arisen for a number of employers. The next bullet, you're also going to have a log that you have on site that's maintained, which states every time a cleaning is done, the date, the time, and the scope of the cleaning. So that is going to have to be maintained on site and available for inspection if requested. New York workplace safety plans also have to include provisions regarding communication. And this is where it gets a little confusing and the guidance isn't entirely clear. We know at a minimum that you have to have a continuous log of every person, including workers and visitors, and here's where it gets weird, who, quote, may have close contact with other individuals at the work site. Now, your guess about what that means is as good as mine, but what we have been recommending is that employers make sure to maintain a list of who is working, a way to track who is working at the office each day. And you have to have a visitor log. You have to have a log that is maintained somewhere on the premises, potentially with a receptionist that identifies what visitors have been to your building or your facility. And the purpose of this is contact tracing. In the event there is a positive case, the government wants to be able to identify what contacts that person might have had at your business. Now, the communication plan also has to specifically say that an employer must notify state and local governments if an employee tests positive. So you're going to want to designate an individual who will be responsible for that communication. I think this next bullet is the one that our clients have asked about the most, and that is health screening. What are we required to do as far as health screening? In New York, the guidance says that you have to perform a health screening for all employees before work each day and for what it calls essential visitors. It doesn't define what essential visitors are, but it says essential visitors. The guidelines provide two examples of screening methods: temperature checks and questionnaires. You do not have to do both. There is no requirement that you do both. The guidance says that at a minimum, you will need to have a questionnaire, and it lists 3 questions that have to be asked within that questionnaire. Number 1, do you have any COVID-19 symptoms? And you can list those out. Number 2, have you tested positive for COVID in the last 14 days? And number 3, have you come in close contact with anyone who's tested positive in the last 14 days? So the state wants all businesses to screen either through temperature or questionnaire or both every day. Now, this has raised a lot of questions with employers about, well, how do we do that? You know, do we take temperatures on site? Do we require employees to take temperatures at home? Do we ask the questions on site? There is no one right answer. There are a number of ways that this can be accomplished. The guidance actually contemplates that screening could be done before an employee comes to work. The guidance references either a telephone interview or, if you have the capability, an electronic form. So for example, you may have employees log on to an app or an intranet or some server in the morning before they come to work and either answer those 3 questions, answer other questions you wanted to ask to screen, take their own temperature, etc. One thing I will say is that the guidelines are very clear that quote unquote health data cannot be stored. And it specifically references temperature data. So you don't want to be storing temperature data of your employees. So going back to the examples of how this can be implemented. So you have remote methods. We have had other employers who create a questionnaire that's in paper form that give their employees 50, 100 copies of the paper form, have them fill out a paper form each morning before they come to work, answering those questions, and then dropping it off when they get to work. So that's another option. Another option would be having a screening station as employees get to work. Have them answer the questions right there. Have them fill out the form right there. Have them take their temperature right there. So that's another option. We have had clients ask, well, is it okay or is it enough if we just put a poster up where employees come into work every day and the poster says, if you're experiencing any of these things, don't come in? And unfortunately, according to the guidance, the answer is no. You have to have, at a minimum, a questionnaire that is completed. And the guidance also requires that those questionnaires be reviewed every day by somebody at your company, and that that person documents the fact that they reviewed them. So we know that there has to be some kind of written questionnaire that's completed each day. But this is an issue that is evolving. I should have said this at the beginning, that this is evolving. This is changing every day. These are the requirements that the state has put forward for phase 1 businesses. Phase 2 is supposed to start tomorrow. We don't have phase 2 guidance yet. So once that phase 2 guidance comes out, this might change. We will certainly keep our ear to the ground on this and make sure we're advising clients on it, but you need to make sure you're checking for the most updated information. Okay, another thing that must be in a workplace safety plan is something or a provision or a section regarding your process. So your process has to state that you're going to have contact tracing and disinfection of contaminated areas once somebody tests positive. That it has to specifically say, here's the cleaning procedure that we're going to follow. if an employee tests positive or someone who's been at the office tests positive. You're also going to have to require notification of employees when there's a positive test. Now, you don't have to require, or you don't have to inform all employees, only quote unquote close contacts. And that's a determination you're going to have to make. You're also going to have to consider or make sure that you are maintaining privacy while you're providing this notification. Okay, there are some additional considerations for workplace safety plans that aren't included in the state's guidance. And one of the simplest is engineering controls. The initial COVID-19 guidance from OSHA talked a lot about these engineering controls. They are specifically physical changes to your space. So whether you move around desks, insert physical barriers, increase fresh air, or change your air filtration systems, there are certain things that you can take to adjust your physical space to limit the risk of transmission. So for example, I mentioned cubicles in an office space earlier on. You may put up plexiglass partitions to separate the spaces. You may physically move the desks apart such that they now maintain 6 feet of social distance. These are the types of physical changes that I refer to when I say engineering controls. Your company should also consider a business travel policy. Now, I'm sure most companies already have them in place. For example, you limit or prohibit non-essential business travel. You have a procedure in place for an appeal to be made. So if you have an employee that feels they need to travel for business for a particular reason, they can obtain approval from one or more people. You should make sure that that is included in your workplace safety plan as well, because that's a precaution that you're taking. And in many cases, it's just going to be memorializing that business travel policy in this workplace safety plan. The workplace safety plan should also, or could also, include a section on how you're going to deal with customer, vendor, or third-party interaction. So for example, are you going to prohibit visitors who have had close contact, etc.? According to the guidance that we talked about before, screening has to take place of essential visitors. So that means that essential visitors have to, at the very least, be asked those 3 questions I mentioned earlier. But you have to think through, what are you going to do if you have a client coming to the office and they would answer yes to one of those questions? How are you going to handle that? So your workplace safety plan should address that as well. Now, another really important thing that workplace safety plans should include, and it's touched on in the New York guidance, but I don't think it's developed fully enough, is what you're going to do with employees who are either positive for COVID-19, who are symptomatic but don't have a positive test yet, or who are asymptomatic but have had close contact with a positive test. So you're going to really want to think through how you're going to address each of those scenarios. There are specific bullets included in the template for individualized tasks, but it doesn't cover everything. So you really need to think through what should be included in your plan with respect to each of those 3 categories. So it doesn't, for example, as noted on the slide, the guidance doesn't include specific recommendations for returning. You may want to consider, if you have somebody, for example, who's symptomatic, who has a fever, who doesn't come to work, when are you going to have them come back to work? The guidance doesn't provide any assistance on that. Are you going to require them to go get a test? Are you going to require them to stay out of work until they get the test results? These are things that you're going to need to think about as you put together your workplace safety plan. All right, the last thing I'm going to talk about is workplace safety plan enforcement in New York. So for now, we know that violations of the state's guidance will be enforced locally. Here in our county, we have a county executive who is trying to put together an executive order that has specific fines for businesses that are violating these guidelines. Every county, every area is going to be different. So you'll have to make sure that you know what your county is doing to enforce. New York has also set up this statewide pause enforcement assistance task force. I think that's the agency that's going to be fielding the complaints from the state's website and then filtering those complaints to the appropriate local authorities. We know that at least in New York, the state is encouraging complaints. So, you know, it's not hard for either employees, customers, vendors to find out where they can make a complaint against you. And of course, the state is doing this to try to make sure that businesses are in compliance with their requirements. There is no clear guidance yet on fines or penalties, so we don't know what those would look like, but we'll certainly try to keep updated on that information. Now, all of the information that I just went through and the information that Lou and Mallory is going to talk about, we have summarized in a publication that I believe is going to be sent out to all of you tomorrow with a copy of this PowerPoint that provides a detailed checklist for you to go through as you're working through your reopening. So look for that. And with that, I will turn it over to Lou, who is going to cover some labor and employment issues associated with reopening.
Thanks, Adam, very much. Very informative, and I encourage you to look for that checklist that Adam is talking about. I think it's very, very helpful, very practical. So you've got this situation where obviously the workplace that our workforce is returning to is not the one that they left. The restrictions that Adams has talked about, all the analyses and risk assessments and all the things that have changed are now going to affect how we repopulate the workforce, who comes back, how they work when they're back, and so on. And Mallory's going to talk to you about communication issues and training and some other things. You know, I can't emphasize enough in the areas that I'm going to talk about, but really all of them, how important it is to train our supervisors, not just the workforce, but our supervisors. You know, there can be a great disconnect between the documents we have and the great plans that we make and getting them down to the average worker. I've given this theme, if you will, for 40 years. My parents were Italian immigrants. My father worked 2 jobs his whole life, and I always tell the story about how his second job at night was at a steel mill that we lived about a block from. And so we used to have dinner together. The family used to have dinner together at 7 o'clock. That's when we saw each other, because he pretty much worked 7 days a week. And, you know, I used to tell people that I knew everything about the supervisor that my father had at that plant. I knew whether he was in a bad mood, a good mood. He was going to let my dad out of work, perhaps for a few hours to see me playing a ball game or something. We knew everything about that particular supervisor, his predilections, his biases, and so on. I didn't know anything about the HR director. I didn't know anything about the HR manual. I didn't know much about the vacation policy. I didn't know much about the collective bargaining agreement. But I knew about the supervisor. And the lesson that I took away from that was that to my father, the face of that company was his supervisor. It didn't really matter what was in the CBA. You know, it does matter eventually, but the policies as written and as promulgated by HR, unless the supervisors understand those, unless they carry them out, unless they're held to those standards of what those policies are and what the program is, it's lost on the average employee. And that lesson applies whether you're interested in having a workforce operate union-free or whether you're interested in them, if it is already unionized, if you're interested in operating grievance-free or lawsuit-free. I think training the supervisors is one of the most important things you can do. And it's also a recognition of how tough it is to be a supervisor these days. I don't think there's a tougher job. And now with the rules that Adam's talking about and the changes that are going to take place in a workforce that we maybe have been in for 20 years, we left it on, you know, March 11th or 12th or 13th. And now we're going to go back to the same place with the same people, and not be able to revert to how we used to do things is going to be a lot different for everybody. So we got to keep those things in mind. We want to understand the governmental workforce restrictions. We got to know those. Those are going to be in your plan. You're going to face decisions about which employee, if you're not bringing everybody back, which I don't think is going to happen immediately for most folks. Who are we bringing back? When? How are we making those selections? Are those selections being done lawfully? Are we picking people on what basis and what criteria? Some people coming back and not others? Have we thought about what we're going to do with employees who are unable physically, emotionally, or otherwise to be able to return to work, or simply are unwilling to return to work based on some, not a medical, but a perceived risk they have of returning to work? And of course, we've got to consider all the legal requirements that affect employees' ability to resume the duties that we're going to ask them to do, especially if they've been reshuffled or changed. Can we take a look at the next slide? I don't know if I changed those or not. What do we do with employees who refuse to work or can't return to work? That's going to happen. I think that's going to happen virtually everywhere. The first thing, and no one size fits all on this. We're not saying people that come back to work must be allowed not to return if they don't want to. We're not saying that somebody who doesn't come back to work for a job that we have should be disciplined or fired. Really, no one size fits all in this area. My advice and what we're telling our clients is to proceed slowly with an employee that's refusing or claims that they can't return to work. First thing we want to know is why. In that category of why, you're going to hear things like, I'm afraid to return to work, I'm afraid to take public transportation, I'm afraid to do this, I'm afraid to do that. It could be that they're in a higher risk group based on their age, or some pre-existing medical conditions pose a higher risk. And that could be medically supported or not medically supported. A doctor may be telling them, I don't think it's a good idea for you to go back to work, or it's not possible for you to go to work. It's too much of a medical risk of imminent danger. Do they live with someone that's in a higher risk category? Do they have childcare obligations because the schools are closed? They need to remain home to take care of their children. So we need to know the reason. Start with the reason. Why is it that someone can't come? Then we want to determine, as we start to formulate, take that reason and formulate, how does that reason fit into what the law provides? Are they excused legally? Do we have an agreement, something under our collective bargaining agreement or an individual contract that applies? Do we have any policies that relate to reasons why somebody may be saying they can't work? Do any of these new statutes, the Family First Act or New York Paid Emergency Leave, apply? Some of the older statutes, the ADA and the FMLA, particularly with the FMLA extension due to the First Families Care Act, Families First Care Act. What are the reasons why? What's being asked? What's being told as to why? Do we have to make an accommodation? What's the range of potential outcomes? Well, they range from making accommodations, excusing the refusal to come back to work, putting somebody on a leave, all the way to potential discipline or discharge. Someone's pregnant, for example, and says, I'm very worried about the fetus that I'm carrying. I'm very worried about coming back to work. I'm very worried about my own immune system. I don't have a note from a doctor. The doctor says I'm fine and I can come back to work, but I am very concerned about the risk. Or my doctor has concerns, but we don't have evidence. Is there evidence of an immediate medical concern, a threat of harm? You know, when you get into something like that situation, and you're talking to somebody like me or Adam or Mallory, we're going to be talking to you about erring on the side of caution. Not just because of legal requirements, but how fact finders are going to look at this situation. Unless to have a serious conversation about whether some discipline is going to result to that person, we're going to have to be talking about how critical that job is, because we're going to be looking at the fact that, can't we make an accommodation for this? Can't we do something that changes the risk? If they can't work remotely, can we give them a leave of absence? How can we accommodate this situation? In this time and with what's gone on with this pandemic, I think we should be looking to accommodation much earlier than we have in the past, whether it's legally required or not. We want to err on the side of avoiding litigation and liability. You're probably going to have an impact on your attendance policies, absences associated with the virus. How are those going to impact the operations? How critical are the jobs that these particular people are doing? How are we going to handle absenteeism among people? How will that impact morale if we've got people that are coming every day, doing more than their fair share of work, and other people are having much higher incidences of absenteeism for whatever reason? We want to talk about how we cover that problem, whether it's cross-training people in the event of absenteeism. How does our call-in process work? How much notice do we need to make sure we know whether people are going to be at work? What does our CBA provide if we're going to start dealing with discipline or some other issues? So what kind of things are we going to run into under our collective bargaining agreement? Next slide, if we could. You want to take a look at all your policies. You had a set of policies in place to govern a workforce of a particular size performing work on premises in a certain way. What's changed as a result of what Adam's been talking to you about is you have a new, there's a new normal. There's a new set of operating rules for the workplace. Maybe some people are remote, some people are at work, and there's a different process, method, operation by which the work is now performed. In light of that, those policies that we created for a different normal have to be reviewed. Should there be modifications to them? Should there be suspensions of some of them? Should we do several things? I'm negotiating a labor contract right now in Manhattan with about 228 professionals, and the biggest issue that we had before this pandemic was their request for flexible scheduling and to be able to work remotely. It's a very much young workforce that is very technical savvy and really would rather not come to the office, period. And I resisted that strenuously since November to March on the fact that you can't work at this job remotely on an unlimited basis, so on and so on and so on. Well, some of that's probably going to change at the bargaining table in light of what's gone on. Nobody's worked at the office. They've all worked remotely. The same thing is going to happen in situations where previously we denied accommodations under state, federal, or New York City human rights statutes, saying that it was unreasonable accommodation to allow somebody to work remotely. We now have strong evidence, or you may have strong evidence in your workplace of people that have been able to do the job very successfully on an accommodation basis. It may be that we have feelings that it can be done better in person, but feelings that it can be done better in person are not going to overcome the requirement that we show undue hardship if that's a request that we're going to deny. I'll stop it there and turn it over to Mallory to pick up on communication and training.
All right, thanks, Lou, and thanks everyone for joining. So the last thing we want to talk about is communication and training. So we've already talked all about how to develop your workplace safety plan, what needs to go in it, but it's really important how to communicate this and how to train your employees and to train your supervisors to enforce this policy. So I know there's a lot to think about. It's probably pretty overwhelming. There are things employers have to think about now that you never thought you'd have to think about in the workplace with PPE, screening checks, all these new things. But communication and training is something that shouldn't be overlooked. It's critically important to your success. So you could have the most thorough and well thought out safety plan. You could have thought about it for weeks at a time, but if you aren't able to communicate this plan to your employees and to your supervisors, then it won't be of much use. So I'm going to go through some of the things on this list here, but here's just a list of some things to consider with communication and training. So assigning a point of contact. In the past, you might have gathered everyone into one room, into one conference room to kind of share new policies, new protocols. That can't really be the case anymore. So you probably want to designate either an individual or a committee that's going to be responsible for communication and for implementation of this plan, so you have a consistent message to your employees. Return to work communication, training of employees and especially of supervisors, workplace signage. We can go back one slide. How to handle third parties who come to your workplace. And then making sure to listen to your employees and review policies you have in place. I think that's good there. Next slide, Adam, please. Thanks. So return to work communication for your employees. This should be done prior to them returning to work. You need to share with them the new measures and protocols you have put in place to keep them safe. This is really important as employees are probably anxious to return. They want to know what you're doing to keep them safe. You want to make sure they know that you're following all this guidance, you're listening to what's going on, you're hearing all the concerns, and you're responding to them. It's also important to communicate this before they return so that all these protocols and policies are adhered to on day one. If you have certain requirements for distancing and what PPE to wear, you want to make sure people are doing this when they show up and they're not showing up clustering, not wearing the proper PPE. You want to make sure they're showing up the day they return, ready to go, and that they know what to do. So really with the return to work communication, you're pulling components from your workplace safety plan and other plans, and you're sharing this with employees to tell them what they need to know before they return to work. And this could be any changes in the physical workplace, so like social distancing requirements, any changes in the layout of the office or building, any closing of break rooms or conference rooms, any closing of those shared work environments that we have, new sanitation cleaning measures, new information on screening and temperature checks, what will be required when employees show up each day to go through that screening process, and information on PPE, what they're required to wear, when and how to get the PPE, and then also what to do if they might have symptoms of COVID. Next, posting your safety plan on site. So in addition to communicating all of this information before the employees return to work, it's also important to keep a copy of your plan on site so employees can refer back to it in case of any questions or in case they're not sure of anything. Workplace signage is also can be really helpful. So consider if there are signs you can put in your workplace to remind employees about washing hands, social distancing, PPE, and the Department of Health website has some signage that they've created that you can use to post on these issues. Also, you have to think about what other types of people are coming to your workplace. So outside of your employees, do you have customers, clients, contractors, visitors? Do they normally come to your workplace? So you likely have implemented new rules for how these people can access your work site. Maybe you changed your hours and your availability. So you need to also think about how to communicate these changes to other people, not just your employees. Maybe just posting notices on your website, workplace signages, or maybe you want to have some direct communication to certain people. This also should be part of your plan as well. Lastly, what information should be covered, how you're going to respond if somebody is positive. So part of your plan, you should have thought out how to respond to cases in the workplace. And it makes sense to kind of have communications ready to go in case this happens. It's better to be prepared than to have this situation come up and have to respond quickly and draft something. Next slide, please. So training, as we've discussed, is especially important for supervisors and managers. You need to ensure that there is consistent adherence as well as enforcement of your plan. So training should include things like information to employees on PPE and face coverings. It should also include information on new employer relief policies. So Adam discussed a lot last week about the new sick leave requirements, the expanded FMLA. It's important to make sure your employees are aware of these new laws. But it's also especially important with supervisors to look at how they are supposed to enforce the new policies in place and how supervisors are supposed to report any non-compliance with the new protocols, how supervisors respond if an employee comes to them with a concern, and how they're expected to respond and be proactive if they believe one of their employees has a suspected case of COVID. So it's important for employers to encourage supervisors to be proactive, to check in with their employees and report back to you if there are any gaps in the communication. You will also need to train individuals who will be conducting the health screenings. So you'll need to train those individuals on how to conduct the health screenings and also what to do if an employee refuses to submit to a screening. As you go along, you should be monitoring employees' compliance with the new plan in place, and you should be taking a review as things go. Be on the lookout for the latest guidance and make sure everything you have is up to date. And to your employees, listen to what they say, make sure that they're getting the message. Next slide, please. So last, documentation, document as much as you possibly can. So maintain copies of your procedures and show what you've been doing to ensure employee safety, what steps you have taken if you've had a confirmed case or if you would have a confirmed case. Keep documentation on how you communicated your new protocols and your new to employees and supervisors. Document any changes you've made along the way and any problems you might have had. So as Adam mentioned, employees and other people are encouraged to report any kind of safety issues. So you have to think about what if an employee brings a claim to OSHA that a work site is unsafe. Well, if you've been documenting everything and showing everything you've been doing to show that this is not the case, you'll be in a much better place. And it's always better to have too much documentation than not enough. So I know this is a lot to think about. Adam and Lou and I have gone over a lot of stuff that you'll need to think about as you start to reopen, but hopefully this has helped you know a little bit more and think about these things. And as you move forward, hopefully we'll have a safe reopening. And I'll pass it back to Anna and see if we have any questions.
We do have two questions. The first one being, do I have a right to refuse to have an employee at work if they don't have PPE?
If they don't have PPE, that's going to depend on where you are, what your local requirements are. So in New York, employers are required to provide masks or face coverings for their employees. It also is going to depend on the PPE. It depends on if we're talking about gloves or just a mask, or if you're a hospital setting and you have a nurse or a doctor that's refusing to wear appropriate PPE. So unfortunately, I can't give a specific answer to that question, but some guidelines are, what business are you in? Check your local requirements. And if an employee, let's assume that your employee has a company issued face covering, you require face coverings at work, you're requiring them according to your state's guidelines and they're refusing to do it, then you should work with the employee to correct the action. That's how you'd flow through it the same way you would flow through any other non-compliance issue you would have with an employee.
And then our second question is, our company is opening up in 2 weeks and our offices have a cubicle setup. We don't have space to stay 6 feet apart, so should we only operate at 50% capacity?
So the first question that you'll have to ask is, what is your state allowing? In New York, they're only allowing 50% capacity at this point. So your state might be doing the same thing. If you cannot maintain the 6 feet, I would say measure your cubicles to see how much distance are between people. If you have more than 6 feet, then you're okay. If you don't have 6 feet, then alternating desks, keeping some people remote, would be an alternative solution.
Go ahead, Liz.
The other option might be to consider alternate schedules or different shifts so that you just don't have everybody there at the same time. But I agree with what Adam said. And those are only 2 questions?
Yes, those are our only 2 questions.
Well,
everything else is answered throughout the presentation.
Excellent.
Great.
Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for your attention, and be careful, and good luck.
We got some great information today. Thank you, Lou, Adam, and Mallory for presenting not only today, but last week. We've had a great webinar series. If anyone has any additional questions for the attorneys, you can go ahead and forward them to my email. It's up on the screen. It's anna@hrsimple.com, and I'll be more than happy to forward those along. Please do look out for the publication, the recording, and the slides. Those will all be sent out tomorrow morning. And thank you for attending, everyone. Please stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks.